We've been talking a lot about generating cycle and how the five elements associate with each other. Just a quick review. With the generating cycle, we're looking at the clockwise cycle of the five elements. So wood generates fire, which generates earth, which generates metal, which then generates water, and then water generates wood again. And we use that cycle typically to help the what we call the child element. So for example, the metal element would we can take wood for example, and then the child element of that would be fire. Okay, so we use that to help. Usually, if we're like deficient in the element, we would use the element before to help boost it. We can also use the same element too. Like if you're weak in fire, for example, you can either treat the fire, or you can treat the element before, which is the wood. All right. So we talked about wood. We talked about fire. We talked about earth. Today we're going to talk about metal and water, and looking at deep dive into it in terms of emotion side, as well as how it relates with the other elements. So with metal, we're looking at the emotions of grief and sadness on one hand, and compassion on the other. So some of you might be wondering, well, why is that? Okay, so and why these two manifest together. When we look at metal, they tend to like to have their own space and like to have things kind of organized. And part of it is really about, it's trying to seek clarity. So the energy of the metal is trying to seek clarity in life. And so like when you think about going through like a sad event, some tragedy that happened, you're trying to just understand and get clarity, like for yourself, why things happen, or what is the reason behind it. Not really more of a water, but more of just from more of a just kind of get clarity with your emotions and with your internal self. And so when you're able to get that clarity, then you reach the other side, which is more the compassion side. Like you are able to understand other people who've gone through that similar experience and really able to connect with them. So those things are very important to metal, but that's why it's really about, it likes to separate things, it likes to organize things, it likes to strive for perfection. And it likes that cold, hard numbers because there's a certain comfort in knowing certain things are a constant, like 1 is always 1, 1 plus 1 is always 2. So there's a certain logic that metal people really find that comfort in. In contrast, the earth doesn't really find comfort in numbers, cold, hard numbers. It finds comfort in being rooted into the earth, in gardening, in taking care of other people. So metal is quite the opposite. It doesn't trust the irregularities and the emotions of people as much. It trusts more in that logic. So you have to think about metal. It's kind of like, on one hand, it's kind of like a knife, where it can be very cutting, okay, or scissors per se. It can trim things. So there's a lot of good and a lot of challenges within that. So going back to, the mother of metal is earth, right? So you can see they're quite opposite in some ways. So it can be a little bit grating, just like, if you think about your parent can be a little bit grating on you, and you just want your own space, you just want to do your own thing. And your parents like, well, make sure you eat, make sure you get to sleep on time. So there's a benefit, right? Because if metal by itself can really get into that aloofness, that separation, and the earth pulls it back. So the two really need each other. That metal, in order to really continue to be in a healthy metal, it needs that groundedness, even though it is about that perfection, that clarity, it needs that connection to the earth to really have some meaning to what it's looking for, as it's trying to clarify what life is about. All right, so that's a little bit heavy, but again, like think about clarity, okay, for metal, and that's what it's striving to do. All right, so let's move on to the next element. which is water, okay? So water is, when we look at it from an emotional side, water is about fear on one hand, and wisdom on the other. So you might think like, okay, well, what do the two have to do with each other? And you look at life, you know, when you're a kid, you're told to not do certain things, like don't touch that stove, you're gonna burn yourself, right? Don't go running out in the street, you may get hit by a car. So because as a kid, you really don't have any fear because you don't have wisdom, you don't have that experience of life and some of the hard lessons that, you know, your parents may have learned, but you haven't learned yet yourself. So we get to, so it's more, so sometimes we learn through fear, right? Like, but it's sometimes it's a healthy fear. You know, there's of course the irrational fear, the overwhelming fear, but don't look at it as the extreme. A healthy amount of fear, we all have that. That's why we don't drive 150 miles per hour. We don't break the law all the time, okay? We don't go ahead and, like, you know, eat 2 pounds of chocolate in one sitting. Okay, I'm not suggesting anything for you to do. But there's a healthy amount of fear to help keep us in line and on the path. And because with water, again, like I talked about how water, when you pour it, right, it becomes formless. It just spreads everywhere. In that way, it's similar to fire, right? Fire is like, it scatters too, but there's a certain meanderingness to water. It doesn't just randomly go everywhere. What it's trying to do is just finding the path back to the truth. So finding that path back to the original source. And in order to do that, okay, it's trying different things, it's meandering, it's going along different paths. But it's always coming back to, it's trying to seek truth, is what what the water is trying to do. It's trying to seek truth, so it's very persistent. Think about how water is it just keeps going, right? Like as soon as it finds a crack or a hole, it's gonna flow out. So that's why the metal is really good for it, because it helps contain and help focus that water energy. Without it, the water's go, okay. So that's why it needs other elements. Like one of the things with water is that it has the gift of water is the imagination. So it does get into its head like metal, but metal's more about intellectual versus water's about wisdom. It's trying to seek kind of understand the larger questions in life, the meaning of life itself is more what the water's into. And so, but when it's delving into that, you can really get into kind of this rabbit hole of, okay, all right, you can go really deep. And then how do you pull yourself out with water? You need a container, you need some way to manage the water properly. And that clarity from the metal is very helpful for that wisdom of the water, okay? And then from water, we go back to wood. And just a quick review of that is that, you know, you water plants, we need water to grow. So that's the wood energy, and how that manifests in terms of emotions is, you know, wood is about that direction, about that focus, but it's not able to sustain that unless it has that wisdom behind it to fuel that wood. Okay, so we looked at the generating cycle. So next time we talk, I'm going to talk about the what we call a control cycle. This is more if you have like an excess amount of an element, like what do you do? Okay, so we'll talk about that. Thank you for joining us. There's a lot of talk today. I know there's a lot, so go ahead and review on YouTube. We'll have it there, but feel free to ask us questions too. All right, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow for the Saturday class. We'll be learning a new exercise. Mary Frances will be doing most of the work tomorrow. Thank you for joining us.